Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Case Studies from Lextegrity, Fraud and Corruption Monitoring. I am Dan Waltman, Vice President of Member Engagement at ECI. Today is the second installment of our three-part series, Data Analytics Demystified, generously sponsored by Compliance Systems Legal Group. Before we get started in today's webinar, let's take a moment to go over the platform tools.
Welcome. Just a few notes about the On24 platform tools for today's webinar. Please use the chat tile to chat with your fellow participants and ECI staff. Use the Q&A tile to submit your questions to the presenters anytime during the presentation. If you don't see these two tiles open, please use the control console to open these and the other tools. For On24 technical support, please click on the help icon. Before leaving today's event, be sure to download your certificate of attendance for your continuing education credit, as well as any resources from our presenters. Lastly, we ask that you complete the event survey. Your responses are important to us as we plan our events for 2022. We hope you enjoyed today's session. Thank you.
And now please welcome Scott Avelino, Principal with Compliance Systems Legal Group, who serves as ECI's Ethics Officer. On to you, Scott.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm going to just give a brief introduction here in terms of setting the stage on why we're talking about this topic. And if you've been in, as you might know, this is a three-part series. If you were in part one, my quick little intro is going to be the same as before, but hang with us because the majority of the presentation is going to be entirely new because we'll be bringing on my co-presenter, Parth Chanda from Lextegrity, who I'll introduce in a second. But as the agenda suggests, I'll be kicking us off here really briefly. We'll be then hearing from Parth. And then over the course of the session, please feel free to submit your Q&A in the dialog box, and we'll take those on towards the end. If you joined us in part one, you heard from Matt Galvin at AB InBev, talking about AB InBev's journey to create a data analytics platform that they are now going to build a consortium around. When we took on the topic of data analytics, it was really so important, not only to the compliance field, but it was being addressed in different ways, in really interesting ways by different organizations. And so what ECI and I did was try to say, how can we bring together a number of different perspectives on this topic? And one of the perspectives that we'll be sharing with you today is from Lextegrity, which will be very different from what you heard from AB InBev. But just to kind of set the stage on why we're talking about this, it really fundamentally comes down to, we've all invested in compliance programs across our organizations, and the driving question is, how do we know whether it's working? Compliance programs aren't static. The businesses they serve are not static. Things are constantly changing. How do we make sure that we've got our headlights on for our program, that we know when things are working well, we know when things are off course, and we know when we need to course correct? And part of that comes through measurement. And I would observe that a lot of the measurement around compliance has been what Wei Chen in this article refers to as process measurements. In other words, looking at how many people we trained in the last year, how many calls we got to the hotline, how many disciplinary cases we had, on and on and on, really looking at measurements around compliance program activity as a proxy for determining whether ultimately we're achieving compliance with our standards. And really what that opens up is this question around outcomes. What are the outcomes we're measuring for? And, she's kind of a little tongue-in-cheek in this article, but basically says marketing departments don't get evaluated based on how many mailers they send out for every program. They get evaluated on how much they incrementally increase sales. We don't evaluate the effectiveness of an addiction program based on how many therapy sessions somebody attends, but whether at the end of the day, they were able to maintain sobriety. And it's kind of think of an analogy too, for compliance programs, it's not how many people we train, although that's an important measure. It's how many people at the end of the day are complying with our standards when it comes to things like gifts and entertainment or other procurement activity or things that we want to make sure that they're doing in a way that's consistent with what company policy calls for. Obviously, the DOJ is looking at this too. This is reflected in the latest iteration that the fraud section came out with just last year on their criteria around questions that they're going to ask when they're evaluating a compliance program. And they are, for the first time, starting to throw out some very tangible questions related to data. For example, whether there is testing for transactions, whether compliance functions have access to data, whether they're looking at risk assessments on a continuous basis instead of just a snapshot in time, what information or metrics are really driving the compliance program. Likewise, their counterparts at the antitrust division are also saying, yeah, we're interested in data as well. And in the antitrust space, data takes different forms as well. But again, they're asking, what are you doing to track data? What are you looking at? Bid information that might be suggestive of potential bid rigging activity? Are you evaluating pricing? Are you monitoring communications? Are you looking at statistical testing to see where there could be an activity that could be red flags or suggestive of anti-competitive activity? When the DOJ began rolling out its criteria and began to roll in data into that criteria, Mark Miner at the time said, hey, the reason we're doing this is because how we're getting our cases. We, on the enforcement side, are using data to identify what companies we might want to pursue. Now, he used the example in that case of, they're looking at things around healthcare fraud and anomalous data that would be suggestive of, again, potential healthcare fraud, or in the commodity space, indicators of potential market manipulation. But what he's also essentially saying is, hey, if we at DOJ can be looking at data to spot potential corporate crimes occurring, then corporations themselves ought to be making use of data too, and especially their own data. Just last year, ECI had Brian Rabbit in a session like this on a best practices forum, talking about how the DOJ is looking at data. And what he's essentially is saying is, we want to and need to see evidence the compliance program is working as advertised, and data gives us some comfort for that. But at the same time, he said he recognized that, not every company, is a Silicon Valley company. That companies are just beginning to experiment with the use of data for their compliance programs. And I think so if you feel like, this is just an area that your company is beginning to tiptoe into, don't feel too terribly behind the curve. I think that's the case for a lot of organizations. But and that sense bears out here in a recent survey that KPMG ran of chief compliance officers just this year, based on about 250 corporate participants on their survey, talking about what are the top ethics and compliance activities that you're looking to enhance. All of them, I think, really have kind of a data flavor to them, either through the use of automation and technology, obviously data analytics, but also monitoring, testing, and other sort of activities as well. I think data plays across this sort of spectrum. Point is that this is an area that is on the minds of lots of ethics and compliance practitioners. But again, let's just get a sense of kind of where everyone in the room is today on your use of data. And there's no right or wrong answer here, but how would you answer it? And how would you describe your company's use of data analytics? I think we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 options here. I won't read them aloud to you, but basically from very basic to fairly advanced, go ahead and make your choice. We'll give you about 20 seconds to make your choice. And while you do that, let me use the opportunity to introduce who our speaker is today, who is Parth Chanda, who I think is just one of the most interesting people who's out in the field today, helping to raise the bar on how companies can use data with respect to data analytics. I've been in the field for a long time, and I've seen lots of kind of service providers come in and out of the field, particularly in the kind of software service space. And oftentimes, what you get are really smart software people, entrepreneurs that have a new fancy tool that they're trying to figure out how it might work for these strange creatures called ethics and compliance officers. And that's not the case with Lextegrity, which I think is kind of what drew me to really have an appreciation for what they're about. This company is formed by former in-house compliance people. Parth is a Harvard-trained lawyer. He's been in in-house organizations like Avon and Pfizer. He built this in part to solve for, and I'll let him tell the story, but kind of the pain points that he felt as an internal compliance person. So what I asked him to do was, Parth, a lot of people are kind of struggling with what data means. What does this stuff look like? What do the dashboards look like? What do the tools look like? Can you just pop over the hood for us today and really share what Lextegrity's approach is to helping companies advance their game with respect to data? And so that's what he's going to do for you today in ways that our other speakers probably will not. So I'm really interested to hear his presentation. And with that, I'll be turning it over to you. But before that, Parth, let's just quickly see where folks are in the room on the results of our poll. And it looks like pretty evenly spread, with people a bit more weighted in the earlier stages or mid stages of the use of data, with a somewhat smaller set of folks being what they would regard as the advanced stage. But with that, Parth, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Scott, for that introduction, those kind words. Thank you for ECI for inviting me to this panel today. So I'm Parth Chanda. I'm the founder and CEO of Lextegrity. We were asked today to join here to really share some case studies of the work that we've been doing, supporting companies globally on their data analytics journeys. So this is going to be pretty agnostic. These are approaches you can take internally as well, but we want to kind of give you some real insights in terms of how we look at data analytics and how we're helping companies implement data analytics. So a little bit about me in terms of background, as Scott shared. I am a lawyer by training. I spent many years in-house at Pfizer, and then at Avon, I oversaw the global anti-corruption programs for both of those companies. Took them through deferred prosecution agreements and other government investigations. Started my career at the World Bank in their internal investigations group, spent some time at Sherman Sterling as well. And really started Lextegrity because I saw a gap in the marketplace. I saw companies really struggling with data analytics. I brought in the first kind of data analytics platform to Pfizer in 2015. And really saw that the future of risk management was about data analytics and automation technology, and really wanted to help companies really operationalize those types of tools. And we're going to get in today into a lot of detail about what that means, how we've helped companies do that, and give you hopefully very practical guidance in terms of what good could look like for your organization, what at least good looks like for our company as we think about these things. So please do ask questions throughout. I'm happy to jump in. I think as with the first session, this will be largely, there will be a lecture component right now where I'll speak for a bit, but then I definitely want to answer your questions. So just a little bit, wanted to give a little bit more context in terms of Lextegrity and our bona fides as a company. So we've been around since 2017. For about 5 years, really supporting global ethics and compliance organizations in large companies. You can see some of our customers here across industries, oil and gas, life sciences, technology, media, entertainment, and other industries. Probably the most, element that I'm most proud of is that we are helping companies navigate some very difficult situations. About a third of our customers have chosen us after some sort of FCPA matter. They're choosing us to remediate their programs and show them to regulators. We've been selected in 3 separate FCPA monitorships. Our software has been in front of the DOJ and SEC several times as a result. And our monitoring solution, our data analytics solution, which we'll spend a lot of time today talking about, was specifically cited by the SEC in Alexion's 2020 FCPA resolution, which was a real nice call out that we got as a result of the help we provided Alexion navigating their data analytics journey and automation journey. So today we're really going to share insights from us. Again, these can be insights that you hopefully can take even to build something internally if you want to, or you can reach out to us to learn more. There's a lot of approaches different companies take. You'll hear from Andrew McBride in the next session about things that they've built internally at Albemarle. And so there's no one size fits all, no magic bullet here, but we hope today we can share a lot of insights to help you really visualize what this could look like. So before I jump into data analytics, I want to take maybe a step back and talk about the challenges in this space for many companies today. I think from the poll you saw, there's a fair mix of companies that are largely early stage, some somewhat advanced, but there's some common challenges that we see in companies that we work with and talk to that's really around disconnection and silos. A lot of system silos, process silos, and as a result, data silos. So you may have multiple systems doing, as you can see here, maybe give you a moment to digest the slide. You may see a lot of, I've been a little under the weather the last couple of days. So you may see multiple systems here that don't communicate with one another, that don't have centralized data across those systems, and that don't then connect with other systems. They don't connect with your T&E system. They don't connect with your ERP system. And then you're really using infrequent sample-based monitoring and auditing to detect issues. And you're not catching those things real time. You may catch them months after they happen, maybe years after they happen, or maybe never at all. So this is the reality for many companies today, and an area where we wanted to really bring technology to bear. So for us, when we think about data analytics, we think about really an end-to-end process, really bringing data across multiple stages of this process, bringing data in at that front end, pre-approval, due diligence process, integrating into those downstream spend systems, HR systems, T&E systems, and then using data analytics to monitor that data continuously, ideally. So 100% of your data on a continuous basis, using not periodic, again, sample-based analytics, and not using necessarily basic analytics, but much more sophisticated fraud detective analytics. And we're going to dive into a lot more detail about what that means. So for us, really, today, I think maybe actually if I take a step back, we want to, and please do add questions to the Q&A if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer those kind of throughout the presentation or at the end. So for us, what we're going to focus on today is really this last piece, is this continuous monitoring and data analytics on spend piece. There's obviously a lot of data that can be gleaned from your process, but we're really going to focus on the continuous monitoring from the data analytics and the continuous monitoring side. And so here on this slide, give you, again, you want to give folks a few seconds to digest here. What we're really trying to visualize here for you is the process of what is continuous monitoring end to end. So for us, continuous monitoring starts with data. So data from your enterprise financial systems. So financial and non-financial systems. So we work today with ERPs, T&E systems, transparency systems for our life sciences customers, HR systems for HR data. We bring in that data in an automated way, ingest that data, map that data, harmonize that data, and any data analytics effort that you partake in or want to build at your company will need to start with that foundational element of data. The next step here is the risk engine itself. So those are the analytics. What are you actually applying to the data? So in our tool, we have about 100 different forensic analyses, a mix of behavioral, statistical, policy-based, rules-based analyses that we apply to that data to drive risk scores of that data, of that transactional data. Now, there are different approaches companies take to this. Some companies focus on key risk indicators and looking at those key risk indicators one at a time, finding anomalies in those key risk indicators. We take more of a holistic approach, looking and applying multiple key risk indicators and analyses to every single spend item, every invoice and payment, every T&E line item in an expense report, and applying multiple risk analyses to each of those items to give each item an aggregated risk score. Now, what's critical in our solution, which I would highlight for any solution that you're looking to build, is a high level of configurability, because your circumstances are going to change, new schemes are going to arise, new third parties are going to be onboarded that bring in new risk, and you'll want to adjust those risk settings, ideally without any data science expertise, without any data scientists on your staff, without any data engineering expertise, ideally with some sort of user interface, which that's our approach. We have a user interface to allow all our compliance and audit users to adjust those risk settings holistically as the tool operates in their company. But if you build this internally, making sure that you have that ability to do that without having to go into the SQL and do all sorts of work on the back end. So that's the risk settings. That's what is driving the risk score. But then what happens with that? Half of the battle here is proving what you did and showing what you did and following up on these high-risk transactions that are flagged for you. So that's where we get into the monitoring review area in the workflow. So in our system, transactions are risk scored from 0 to 5, low to high. And then the highest risk transactions are escalated up for reviewers to review. That could be a reviewer in audit, in compliance, in your monitoring function, in internal controls. And that team, those individuals, those trusted individuals, can follow up on those transactions, document all the work they did, all the way through to remediation items. But it's all documented with an audit trail. So if you're going to build something like this internally, would highly suggest you have that whole workflow piece thought through as well. And then we have a whole visualization engine to explore the data. And so we're going to dive into each of these in a lot more detail over the next 20 minutes or so, but wanted to give maybe a level set in terms of, for us, what continuous monitoring looks like. Maybe the last component here of just the risk domains that we work with. Today we're working with customer expense, vendor spend, customer revenue, order to cash, and for our life sciences customers, transparency, aggregate spend data. And we're working with some key systems here, SAP, Oracle, Workday, Concur, et cetera. We have brought on other systems, and again, we have a very agnostic model, but having a good inventory of your core systems is going to be critical for success. So with that kind of setup, maybe let's dive in now to continuous monitoring. So from our perspective, we want to spend a little bit of time kind of detailing what we think continuous monitoring looks like, at least for us, and what it could look like for you. And from our perspective, continuous monitoring really has three core elements. We think about it kind of like a stool. There's three legs to that stool. There's data, there's a methodology, and there's a process. And we're going to cover each of those in some significant detail for the next few minutes. So really the first piece, and all of these elements are critical. They're foundational for a continuous monitoring data analytics effort to succeed in your organization. And how we support our customers is we manage this whole process. But if you're going to look at this internally, you want to make sure you have key stakeholders involved in every step of this process. So continuous monitoring data, that's the first piece, the foundational element. So all of you have heard of the 80-20 rule, the pattern of behavior. You see that 80-20 working here in the data analytics space often for companies where 80% of the time is spent working with the data. finding the data, harmonizing the data, organizing the data, cleaning the data. And only 20% of the time then is left really analyzing the data and driving really valuable insights from that data. Well, at Lextegrity, our view is that those numbers should really be flipped. It should really be that 80% of your time is spent analyzing the data and finding risk, and 20% of the time should be spent ideally upfront managing that data process and building that foundational element. So we're going to dive into each of these pieces in a little more detail. And what does that mean? Why are companies spending 80% of the time on the data piece? And what does an effort in data analytics, building a data analytics platform, really entail for you? So the first element here is really that preparation for analysis. There's three core components of data. The first is preparation for analysis. The second is automation, and the third is harmonization. And I'll talk about each of those in detail. The first is preparation for analysis. And what that means is that really not trivial task of preparing and bringing in that data, organizing it into a data model that can be actually used to perform analyses. You have to get the data from the raw data into a state where it can be analyzed. So what that can mean for an SAP or ERP here, like you'll see, there could be potentially 30 different payment methods you have in your ERP. In your T&E system, you may have 250 different expense categories. Maybe you have 15 different entertainment categories. But all of those things can be ultimately distilled down further. So those could be distilled down to one entertainment category. Your payment methods could be potentially distilled down to check, wire, ACH, etc. But there is some, again, non-trivial work here of preparing that data and getting it into that format. Now, we at Lextegrity do the bulk of this work for our customers. We have models and data spec documents, etc., that do this. But if you're going to do something like this internally, a significant amount of your time with IT and finance will be spent preparing this data for analysis. But once that data is prepared, that is not it. We want to prepare this data and not just prepare it once, but prepare it once and set it and forget it if you can, largely. Obviously, if there's changes to your source systems, you may have to make updates. But the second piece of this is automation. Again, I'm trying really distilling this down to its simplest components, but we can obviously talk about each of these components in a lot of, you could spend an hour talking about automation. But here you can see a big part of the data analytics platform or process being successful is that data not only be prepared for analysis, but also be automated. That extraction and that preparation be automated for use. And so what that could mean is here you can see a kind of flow of vendor spend data and all the steps involved in automating that data. Multiple steps that depend on prior steps, each step needing to be logged, and each step needing to be able to be restarted independently. So there's a lot of engineering effort needed to do that automation of the data extract work. Again, at Lextegrity, this is something we do via API connectors, increasingly with scripts for our customers, but this is an area, again, a partner can make a lot easier for you. But if you want to build this internally, again, an area where you'd have to work very closely with your finance and IT teams and teams that are working very closely with that finance data to see that you can automate this process. It looks like there might be some issues with the sound that we're hearing in the Q&A, but I'll let the moderators deal with that if there is an issue. But I'll keep going. So that automation is a big piece. And just to give you a sense of kind of the scale of this automation and the scale of data where automation is going to be very important is, again, in the T&E space, you're going to have multiple expense reports for each employee, each expense report having multiple line item expenses, each line item expense potentially having multiple attendees. So you might have a scenario where you have 1,000 person company that has 100,000 line items of data per month coming out of a T&E system, given when you multiply the number of line items times the number of attendees, the number of expenses, et cetera. So you're talking about, for a very small company of 1,000 employees, you can have 1 million rows of data coming out of the system every year. Obviously, automating that is going to be important for this to be very successful. So automation is another key element of the data piece of this. And then finally, I want to touch on harmonization. So harmonization is another area where once you have that data in, you want to really harmonize that output of that data for your internal users. Where you're going to get a number of data tables where all the data is kind of a mess, that they're in fields, but you want to make that visible to your users in a way that's harmonized, where you can see, here you can see a transaction that is a vendor related, in our system is invoice related, and a transaction that's T&E related. But you can see a number of the fields map very similarly or close to one another. So because we want to give the reviewers and our customers clear information that's relatively harmonized across risks so that they can action these transactions quicker and they can resolve these transactions faster. You want to then also, if you can, enrich that data with more data from your source systems. So you might have the nature of spend, and you might have subcategories of that spend that you have in your T&E system or your ERP system that you want to bring in. And then you'll also want to ideally bring in some subject level context around the subject of the spend itself. So if you can show what has the tenure been of this vendor or this supplier or this employee? Are they a 1-month-old vendor or are they a 2-year-old vendor? What's their rolling 12-month spend? So you'll see some examples in our tool that we have on the right. Those are just great additional data points for your reviewer to drive insights into the specific transaction they're looking for, to drive conclusions. Because ultimately, there is a human element to these data analytics. And if the more you can provide your human beings who are reviewing this with context information, the more successful they can be in using the outputs of your data analytics. So that covers really, I'll pause there, that covers really the first leg of that stool of continuous monitoring around data. The next leg of that stool is really around methodology. And so we'll spend a few minutes there on methodology now. So let me just jump in here to the 3 core components of methodology. For us, that's really the setting of the analyses, the risk ranking of transactions, and then the setting of a threshold above which transactions are reviewed from a monitoring perspective. So again, what our system does is we take that 100 or so analyses, and again, there may be 20 analyses running on every invoice simultaneously, 20 analyses running on every T&E line item, and all of those analyses run on the transaction to give that transaction an aggregated risk score in an automated way, ideally on 100% of your transactions. And that's really, back to Scott's point at the beginning and the DOJ's point, in our minds, that's what really gives you a sense of the effectiveness of your program. The training metrics, the hotline reports, et cetera, are going to give you some view. But when you're testing 100% of transactions and following up on outliers, then you're really using sophisticated analytics. You're really going to get a better sense of the reality on the ground for you. So for us, the analysis setting really is the start of the process. So we have all of these analyses. They can all be adjusted in our tool, at least through a user interface with no coding or data engineering needed. If you did build something like this internally in your organization, you probably will need to hire data scientists and data engineers to do this on the back end, which is, again, a reason why we don't believe that that's the future for compliance organizations, to have armies of data scientists. If you do have access to a slew of data scientists who can build something like this, great. You should use them to do that. But again, what's scalable to us is really having a solution that allows you to configure this. But we have some smart presets in our system. Obviously, we have things like sanctioned countries and other things like that in the right risk buckets. But beyond that, we really want to make sure our customers can tweak those settings and evolve those settings as their risks change over time. And that's going to be very important for you. You're going to have risk assessment findings, investigation findings, audit findings, new policies, new procedures, new business lines, new countries you're entering into. And all of those should impact your settings on some level, or may impact. You may have an investigation and a scheme that was uncovered in that investigation, and you want to be able to define parameters to look for that scheme in future spend items. So having that level of flexibility in your continuous monitoring data analytics approach will make it just much more scalable over time and powerful over time. So that's the risk setting piece. I did want to spend a little bit of time to show maybe some of the schemes, a couple of schemes where these types of multi-layered data analytics could really be effective and how they would be applied to schemes like that. So when you take T&E asset misappropriation, for example, that's a common fraud scheme where someone is using their T&E to generate proceeds from the company. So either they're incurring an actual expense, but it's illegitimate. They are buying personal things at Amazon. They're going to a venue where they shouldn't be going, a bar, and buying a round of drinks for their friends, or they're submitting fake expenses and invoices as personal cash, no receipt expenses to generate proceeds to pay a government official for bribery or corruption reasons, et cetera. So T&E asset misappropriation is a clear risk area for many companies. And there's multiple, and here is just the sample of analyses you could apply to a T&E item to look for asset misappropriation, but want to walk through a few just for you all to get a sense of the power that you could gain and the insights you could gain by applying this multiple levels of analytics. So high cash value, that's an area, an easy one, low-hanging fruit. Is the expense itself very high value in terms of cash? That's a common way people are going to expropriate money from a company is submit cash expenses. There's no credit card or merchant category code to check on a credit card, and they can generate a reimbursement for that quote unquote legitimate expense. But is this an outlier in terms of the amount that it is from a cash basis? Then on top of that, you could layer a look at whether the cash usage is in an unusual category. So there's there's categories in which you would not today, with the usage of credit cards everywhere, you would not expect the usage of cash. So you wouldn't expect the usage of cash to book airfare, to book a hotel or pay for a hotel. So an unusual cash analysis could be looking at transactions in categories where you would expect cash to be unusual. Then you can layer on top of that analysis the level of reimbursement of cash for this specific employee compared to their peers. So that's what we call cash reimbursement ratio. So this might look at, for this particular sales rep, compared to other sales reps in the company, in that country, their use of cash is quite an outlier. So sales reps typically use 40% cash, 30% cash. This sales rep is at 80% cash or 60% cash, et cetera. So again, that would be another analysis you can use. So I'll maybe highlight a couple more here just so you can see them. Round value, that could look at, whether there is a direct round value, it's $100 flat. Again, not standing alone a huge indicator of risk, but together with all these other 5 or 6, aggregative, additive in terms of risk. Then use of cash near the receipt threshold. So someone is frequently submitting expenses that are right under the $50 receipt threshold at $49, $48. So this one's also looking at it from a frequency perspective over a period of time. And also you could layer on that, checking whether there's a receipt image as well in that. So there's more you can add. I mentioned merchant category codes that look at whether there's an inappropriate merchant type that was used. That's coming from your credit card company itself. And there's way more analyses that we also apply. But now you can kind of see when you now apply these 6, 9, 12 different analyses to every expense, you can see how much power you can gain, how much insight you can gain, really putting every expense through the ringer, frankly, in a way that no employee is really going to be able to game really effectively. Obviously, fraudsters are going to get more and more clever over time, and the analyses need to evolve. But you can see how our system, what it does is it takes each of these analyses, weights them, and together gives the transaction a higher risk score for your review. So that's generally the model. I wanted to walk through maybe one specific example here. I want to walk through another one on the vendor invoice side. I really wanted to give you that level of detail today to really explain what that looks like, what a multi-dimensional fraud analytic review would look like. So now moving to another scenario, fictitious vendors. So this is another one where you might have a really high value embezzlement, asset misappropriation, corruption happening when employees set up fictitious vendors, and those vendors are contracting with the company and invoicing large dollar values. And every FCPA case has either fictitious or vendors who are being used to generate money and proceeds to make improper payments. So this is one where you may apply multiple, again, you would want to apply multiple analyses, but different analyses. So conflicts of interest is a great one. Again, it's very low-hanging fruit for many companies because the data is easily accessible. But this is one where you might match vendor attribute details from your vendor master with employee master details from your employee master. So there you're looking not just at name and address, because that's easy. If someone sets up a vendor with their home address, that's going to be pretty easily detected. But looking at other attributes like phone number, maybe national identifiers and other data that's in your employee master, checking that against your vendor master. So it might be a complete sham vendor. It may be a vendor that belongs to a spouse or that's colluding with the employee to generate proceeds. Or it may be a vendor that belongs to another employee in the company. So conflicts of interest check is one layer. Then aggregate limits detection. This would highlight spending over a period of time in aggregate. So looking at 3 months of invoices for a specific vendor and seeing if the frequency or amounts are anomalous compared to other vendors in that category. So is your paper supplier, which, from a front-end due diligence perspective, most companies don't ever think about, is your paper supplier acting in ways in the data, in the financial data, acting in ways, the payments acting in ways that are completely anomalous compared to other paper vendors in your company. Then on top of that, looking at attribute changes at a vendor level. So that's looking at, vendor detail changes that are happening at a high frequency. The bank account's changing, the address is changing, other determinants of risk are changing frequently. And then you might have the ability to also bring in visual analysis on top of this to look at outliers. So just like that T&E asset misappropriation example, this can kind of show you how you can have multivariate layers. You can obviously look at bank account country, whether it's offshore and other things. There's many, many analyses that we run on every invoice to aggregate up a risk score. But this just, again, gives you a sense of those puzzle pieces that come together to risk score a transaction higher or lower from a review perspective. So where does that all go? Now that you've risk scored everything, this next piece of our methodology and sound methodology from our perspective is that risk ranking. So obviously you do not want to look at 100% of your transactions. That defeats the whole purpose of a continuous monitoring tool. This is really looking to escalate those highest risk transactions. So what you should have the ability to do is to risk rank. So risk rank those transactions with that aggregated score and escalate those highest risk transactions, but also have some flexibility in that risk ranking to set super risk factors. So thinking about something like a sanctioned country, if Syria or Somalia shows up in my vendor bank account details, I want to see 100% of those. So the overall transactional risk score might be low for the other indicators, but this one is an automatic one that I want to see at the top of my list immediately. So risk ranking is that second piece of the methodology that is very important. Because again, from our perspective, and I think, and having a number of customers who've been in front of the DOJ and SEC and having spoken informally to them on several occasions, I think they appreciate that monitoring and data analytics is also risk-based. You should have some ability to apply judgment, set the right thresholds and risk ranking, obviously in a defensible way and in an auditable way, but in a way that is manageable by your company. And so the final piece here is really that threshold. This is the last piece of really having a program that's fit for purpose and fit to your company, your industry, et cetera. Being able to set a threshold above which you want to see transactions. So again, you don't want to see 100% of your transactions. For T&E, that might be 3.5. For invoices, that may be 4.5 or 5 or 4.8. Really having that flexibility, that ability to configure that, to change it over time, and do it in a way that's very audit trailed through, obviously trusted admins who can make those changes is going to be very important. And I would say all of this, the thought behind all of this, the input behind all of this, ideally should be cross-functional. There's a lot of stakeholders who can inform the methodology piece here. Compliance, audit, investigations, internal controls, procurement, your country compliance attorneys and non-attorneys, et cetera. So it's an iterative process. For us, for our customers, we bring in the data and automate that step. Then we make sure that there's a pilot period where we run the data multiple times and help the customer change their risk settings, give them guidance. And then, after multiple iterations, the platform is really ready to go live. Because it really, we had a customer where one of our keywords in our library was in their business unit name. So, that keyword is going to shoot up a lot of false positives for them. For them, it was as simple as deselecting that keyword and rerunning the data. So you want it to be that iterative if you want it to really be successful, because this is a constant, continuous improvement loop. And you also want to have machine learning, if possible. We have machine learning in our platform where the system learns over time as you resolve transactions. And so with that, maybe in the interest of time, we'll touch on the last piece of this continuous monitoring stool, which is the process. So really making sure that you have a process for identifying the root cause of the issues that you identify. So if you have a vendor transaction, an invoice that's been flagged, our system gives you all of that detail, but then gives you a whole explanation of that score, as well as a whole workflow to track your follow-ups that you've taken, upload documentation, et cetera. We've seen companies who've developed things like, analytics processes internally. They make sure they have some sort of shared site or SharePoint or Box site, et cetera, to do this. But you want to make sure you have an audit trail version of what you did with the transaction that was flagged for you. In our tool, the nice benefit that we have is this drives the machine learning. So this drives, if you mark something as a false positive, you can then feed the learnings back into the system. And then from a root cause perspective, the visualizations, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but visualizations help with that root cause analysis. Visualizations help you explore beyond just this one transaction. So if I found one vendor transaction, let me look at all the transactions for this vendor. Let me look at similar vendors in the market and see their risk score transactions, et cetera. And that can then drive much quicker resolution of transactions and investigations and help you get to that root cause and see if issues are systemic or not. And then obviously tracking all the way through to remediation is very important. And then finally, maybe just to talk about mindset in process, because that's something a lot of folks don't think about, that this is a process itself, and there's a number of steps here that we highlight, bringing in that transactional data, risk scoring, identifying and remediating, and seeing the program results are what I've talked about to date. But it's the end of that risk loop, continuous improvement loop, that includes those setting adjustments, new risk scheme identification, and then iteration on your analyses that will make your program continuously evolve and continuously improve as your data analytics team, like we do for our customers, builds you more and new analytics as well. And then finally, maybe just to close it out, I know I wanted to turn it back to Scott for some Q&A. Just want to touch on what we've seen from case studies with our customers of how cross-functional a data analytics continuous monitoring platform can become for your company or for many companies. Across these functions on the left, from compliance to audit to procurement, investigations, HR, and M&A, we've seen customers use the monitoring review, that transactional review area, largely in compliance, audit, and investigations, but then open up other things like the risk visualizations, third-party risk management team, seeing procurement data and data on risk for third parties, opening that up much more broadly. For investigations, we see companies using that data to inform investigations and frankly get to the bottom of subject data within seconds. So if I get a whistleblower complaint about Scott, I can find his information and everything's risk scored in the system immediately. And that can give you clearer insights to go to middle management and HR very quickly. And then we're seeing companies increasingly use this tool to assess their program. And then in more edge case, we're seeing companies start to really think about how we drive this to drive performance assessment for individuals. So down to the country manager, is part of their performance measurement each year for their bonus require them to decrease their country, vendor risk score year over year. So that's really more kind of bleeding edge of a use case, but definitely areas that companies can explore. So finally, to close it out, the various ways we see companies using these continuous monitoring tools, and the end goal is really to create that kind of risk hub in your organization that all of those functions can use. Do that in a way that increases your risk coverage from periodic and sample-based to 100%, ideally globally, of all your spend items. Allow you to have more confidence that your compliance program is actually effective because you're doing testing of everything, kind of like COVID. The more you test, the more confidence you have on, community spread, et cetera. Using your resources more efficiently. So having your investigations team not spend their days chasing finance and looking through, raw concur extracts and getting to that data very quickly. Having your procurement team have insights in terms of onboarding new vendors, et cetera. And then prioritizing what your compliance program and you as a CCO or an audit team want to focus on. And I don't know if there's one more. And then also having this tool set some baselines for your organization to evolve over time. So it sets a very objective baseline to grow over time to see, have there been upticks? We've entered a new market? Are we seeing upticks in vendor procurement fraud from the baseline that's been in place for the last 2 years? And so with that, maybe I'll turn it over to Scott. I didn't want to just share my final parting thoughts for anyone to feel free to reach out to me. My email's here. You can go to our website. We've got a resources page with a podcast with Hui Chen, as Scott referenced her at the beginning, a 3-part podcast series with her, as well as some other resources. So we're happy to help. If you're building this internally, happy to chat with you and have a workshop. If you're looking to accelerate this with a provider, again, happy to be there and help out if we can. So with that, thanks.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you so much, Parth. That was a terrific presentation. I forgot to mention in my comments that, the DOJ, said, hey, we're using data to identify cases that we want to pursue. And so we're just going to write data into our own, guidelines in terms of what we're looking for in our compliance programs. DOJ is also, and other regulators are learning about the use of data through presentations like this, when companies have had significant compliance breakdowns. They are upping the game in terms of, wanting to be in a position to prevent or detect these instances in the future and telling DOJ what they're doing about it. And they're learning about what companies are doing more on the leading edge to get ahead of some of these issues and saying, hey, we're going to be asking about what other companies are doing about this too in the future. So I do see the bar raising here. We've got some great questions coming in here, Parth. Here's a fun one, which is, how far are we in analytics to detect fraud and corruption in real time as business as usual? I think we would all, I think for the average company, might regard kind of this topic as being, kind of a little futuristic. But where do you see us in the evolution of all that, Parth? At what point are we going to be? Is this going to be business as usual and not particularly novel?
Yeah, I think Matt's presentation last week was a good example. The future is here already. This is, I think, already available. It's available in our platform, and many companies are already using it to do this real time. So we're doing daily concur. We're doing daily, sometimes weekly, vendor payment analyses for all of our customers. That's really kind of the edge of where companies are. It's a week, maybe it's 2 weeks delay. For many, it's one, it's the same day. So I think we're already there. And we're capturing some of this data early in the process as well. So, we capture data from a PR to PO to invoice to payment. So there's abilities to make this more predictive and even earlier in the process. And so, I think, again, I think this is the future, and I think it's there. And I think the government's already seen these types of tools with, AB InBev and what you'll hear from Albemarle next week. So they've seen what's possible already. So, again, I think starting somewhere is would be my advice, because it's only going to become clearer as you do it. I did see, Scott, one other question that's kind of related to this is are there do we start with the recommended risk formulas, et cetera? So that is something I want to be clear, like, we don't give you a blank slate, and I don't think you think you want to work with a partner who has some knowledge and expertise, because you don't want to start and try to figure out how to set every setting. So there is a kind of initial smart presets, and then you can layer on that what you need in your organization.
Yeah, and Parth, you worked with companies starting at day one or day -1 to having a system up and running, and it's always the adage of I wish I knew then what I know now. And so in that vein, what are some common misperceptions that companies have, or maybe just fumbles that companies have when they're getting started in this space that they come to figure out as they move along? How would you help some companies in the audience kind of learn from the mistakes of others, I guess, in terms of getting started?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the main hurdles and obstacles, I think, are one, just fear, fear that we can't achieve this because our data is not clean. It's, and there are challenges there. Obviously, if you have 125 ERPs, you may have a challenge in getting that all under control. But, the idea that our data is incomplete, it's not clean, it's not even worth starting because we know we're not going to get anything valuable from this. I think can be dispelled very quickly, because most of these analytics run on core data that should be in your system. Some of that, vendor classification, et cetera, is supplementary, and it's nice to have, but it's not must have. The other thing is just getting the right stakeholders involved early. So, compliance and audit think this is great, but the finance and IT team comes in at the end once the decision's already been made, and they need to do some of that work of getting the data, and now they don't have someone that they're going to really offer up, and then there's a kind of battle. So, having those stakeholders early in the process involved so that they understand what it entails on their side, I think is a good idea. But I'd say the biggest takeaway for me is just start small, start somewhere. Just with anything like forming a new habit, you've got to start somewhere to get to where you want to go. It's really the same approach here as well.
So here's a question that tees off of that. It says, in an organization using Workday and no existing similar system, where and how should we start? Any advice? So here's a company, hey, we got Workday. What would you do with Workday?
Yeah, and so I guess that's a great question. It's, again, like, I think you want to work, if you go with a partner, you want to work with a partner who can work with multiple systems. If you build it internally, to talk to the IT folks who own those systems. But yeah, Workday has HR, but then they also have T&E and increasingly procure to pay for companies. So I would, to that person, I'd ask, where these core processes around T&E, procure to pay, et cetera, sit. If they're all in Workday, great. I mean, then frankly, you have one system to integrate with, and your life actually might be easier. But one is just getting an inventory of where your data is. Again, if procure to pay and T&E, et cetera, are the risks you want to look at, knowing where the data is, and then going from there, really, frankly. And I know there was a question about challenges around security. How do you deal with access in different countries and things like that? So that is another piece I didn't touch on. We've built something that can segregate data within our tool. So you can have European employees only see European data, et cetera. That is something that I think if you're going to build something like this internally, you want to make sure your data team can manage, because that's going to be something you're going to come up against pretty quickly, that the privacy team doesn't want this to be so global. They want it to be really segregated. And, obviously, if you want to turn this over to your country managers and others, you don't want them to see you may not want them to see other countries' data. So having that be part and parcel of what you've built is really a good idea.
And I'll have this be the last question that we take on, which is, how long does this take? How long does it take to tailor your solutions to a customer's needs? I'm sure there's probably some variance there, but what would you say to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think having built a technology platform and not having, kind of a accounting firm or outside consultant firm perspective, we have a model already. We have automation already. So typically we see the process from, taking between 1 to 4 to 6 months, depending on system, to really have from kickoff to go live. So lower hanging systems like Concur, T&E systems, those can be up and running in a matter of weeks. Larger global procurement, ERP implementation might take 3 months, start to finish, or 4 months. But it's really a manageable amount of time from our experience. But it's also a matter of getting the right stakeholders involved up front so that you can execute, once you, sign on the dotted line.
Great, thanks. I'll invite Dan back in to close us out, but wanted to say again, Parth, thank you. To remind the audience that we will be doing this one last time. Part 3 of the series is next week. We'll be featuring Andrew McBride from Albemarle, who Parth mentioned a few times in his presentation. I really encourage you to join us for that session as well. Andrew is a Chief Compliance Officer. He sits in-house. He sits in your chair every day, and he kind of built a system like this, really in-house. And so you'll be hearing a completely different perspective again next week. And so, again, we look forward to continuing the dialogue with you. Parth, thank you so much for sharing the Lextegrity story. I think it is, an example of what other companies can be doing in this space. And Dan, we'll turn it back over to you to close us out.
Well, on behalf of ECI, I just wanted to thank Parth and you, Scott, for such thought-provoking and engaging session today and a great conversation. I just had 3 brief points before we closed out today. As a reminder, this webinar is available on demand and will be available from the ECI website, ethics.org, by the end of this week. Be sure to fill out the session survey so we can continue to provide content and events that are of interest to you. And if you have not already done so, please download your continuing education certificate material at the end of the series. Thank you again to Compliance Systems Legal Group for sponsoring this event, and thank you all for attending.